In the neon-drenched shadows of a city called Gyeongsang, there lived a girl named Ilara. She was like a wildflower growing in the cracks of a concrete sidewalk, quiet, beautiful, and completely unnoticed by the giants who walked above her. Ilara worked 3 jobs just to keep a roof over her head, her hands always rough from cleaning the marble floors of people who never looked her in the eye. She was lonely, but she was safe, or so she thought. In that same city lived a man named Jin Ho. In the whispers of the back alleys, they called him the Iron Shadow. He was the king of the underworld, a man whose name could stop a heart from beating. He lived in a fortress of glass and steel, surrounded by men who would die for him, yet he was the loneliest soul of all. One rainy Tuesday, Ilara's life took a turn that no one could have predicted. Her phone buzzed with a notification she thought was for her boss. She was tired, her vision blurred by exhaustion, and her fingers trembled as she typed a message meant for a friend, a cry for help that would change her destiny forever. She hit send, not knowing the digital signal was traveling straight into the lion's den. The message Ilara sent was simple and heartbroken. It said, "I can't take it anymore. They took everything, and now they're coming for the last thing I have. Please, just tell me where to go." She thought she was messaging her cousin, the only person who knew about the debt her late father had left behind, but the number was off by a single digit. Miles away, in a room that smelled of expensive leather and cold ambition, Jin Ho's private phone vibrated. This was a phone that only 3 people in the world had the number to. It was a phone used for war, for multi-million-dollar deals, and for life-or-death commands. When he picked it up and saw the message from an unknown contact, his eyes narrowed. He was a man who dealt in certainties, and this was an anomaly. Most men would have deleted it. Most men would have blocked the number. But Jin Ho felt a strange pull, a flicker of curiosity in his frozen heart. He stared at the words, "They took everything." He knew what it felt like to have the world stripped away. Instead of putting the phone down, he did something he had never done before. He typed back, "Who is this?" Jin Ho's reply was short and cold, like a blade of ice. Back in her cramped apartment, Ilara saw the reply and gasped. She thought her cousin was being stern with her. "It's Ilara," she typed back quickly, her tears hitting the screen. "The men from the docks, they broke into the shop today. They said if I don't have the money by midnight, they'll burn the house down with me in it. Please, I don't have anyone else." She put the phone down and buried her face in her hands, sobbing. She didn't notice that the reply didn't come from a familiar name. Meanwhile, Jin Ho sat in his high-backed chair, watching the words appear. The men from the docks. He knew exactly who they were. They were a small-time gang, scavengers who preyed on the weak, the kind of filth he usually stepped over without a thought. But the desperation in her words struck a chord. He looked at his reflection in the dark window. He saw a monster, but even monsters have a code. He didn't know who Ilara was, but he knew he hated the men she described. He stood up, his long black coat billowing like a shroud. Jin Ho signaled his right-hand man, a silent giant named Kyle. "Find the location of this signal," Jin Ho commanded, his voice a low growl. Kyle didn't ask questions, he simply nodded and began to work. Jin Ho went back to the phone. He wanted to know more. He wanted to know why this stranger had reached out to him even by accident. "Where are you?" he texted. Ilara, thinking her cousin was coming to rescue her, sent her address immediately. She felt a glimmer of hope. She started packing a small bag, throwing in her mother's old watch and a few photographs. Outside, the rain turned into a torrential downpour, masking the sound of heavy boots walking up the stairs of her apartment building. There was a loud bang on her door. It wasn't the rhythmic knock of a savior. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of a predator. Ilara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The men from the docks were early. She grabbed her phone, her only lifeline, and hid under the small wooden table in her kitchen. "I'm scared," she texted, her fingers shaking so hard she could barely see. "They're at the door. They're breaking it down. Please hurry." Jin-ho received the message just as he was stepping into his armored car. His face turned into a mask of pure fury. "I am coming," he replied. He didn't say who he was. He didn't explain the mistake. He just felt an overwhelming urge to protect the voice on the other end of the line. He told his driver to ignore the speed limits. The city blurred past them, a streak of neon lights and gray mist. In the apartment, the doorframe groaned and splintered. Two large men burst in, smelling of cheap cigarettes and malice. They laughed when they saw the tiny apartment. "Where are you, little mouse?" one man yelled, kicking over a chair. Ilara squeezed her eyes shut, holding her breath. She prayed to the stars, to the moon, and to the mysterious person on the other end of the phone. She didn't know she hadn't summoned a cousin. She had summoned a storm. The men found her quickly. One of them grabbed her by the hair and dragged her from under the table. Ilara screamed, but the sound was drowned out by a clap of thunder. "You thought you could hide?" the man sneered, his breath hot on her face. "You owe us, and since you can't pay in cash, you'll pay in other ways." He raised a hand to strike her, and Ilara flinched, waiting for the pain. But the blow never landed. Instead, the entire front wall of the apartment seemed to explode. The sound of screeching tires and breaking glass filled the air as a black SUV plowed right through the entryway. The two thugs jumped back in terror, shielding their eyes from the blinding headlights. The door of the vehicle opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a suit that cost more than the entire building, and his eyes were as cold as a winter grave. It was Jin-ho. He didn't look at the thugs. He looked straight at Ilara, who was crumpled on the floor, shaking. The room went deathly silent. The thugs recognized the man instantly. Every criminal in Gyeongsong knew the face of Jin-ho, the boss of the Iron Shadow Syndicate. Their bravado evaporated, replaced by a paralyzing fear. "Mr. Han?" one of them stammered, dropping Ilara's arm as if it were red-hot coal. Jin-ho walked toward them, his steps measured and heavy. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out and took the man by the throat, lifting him off the ground with terrifying strength. The other thug tried to run, but Kale was already there, blocking the exit with a silent, menacing presence. Jin-ho turned his gaze to Ilara. She was staring at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. She realized then that this was not her cousin. This was someone far more dangerous, yet he had come for her. Jin-ho looked back at the man in his grip. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice directed at Ilara, but his eyes fixed at the predator. Ilara couldn't speak. She just pointed at the man Jin-ho was holding. Jin-ho's grip tightened. "You touched something that didn't belong to you," he whispered. The thug's face turned purple as he clawed at Jin-ho's iron hand. With a flick of his wrist, Jin-ho tossed the man across the room like a bag of trash. He turned to Kale and gave a small, sharp nod. Kale understood. He grabbed the two men and dragged them out of the ruined apartment into the rainy night. They wouldn't be seen again. Jin-ho then turned back to Ilara. He reached out a hand to help her up, but then paused, realizing his gloves were stained with the dust of the wall. He slowly peeled them off and tucked them into his pocket. He offered a clean hand to the girl on the floor. Ilara hesitated for a moment, looking at the hand of the most powerful man in the city. Then she reached out and took it. His skin was warm, a startling contrast to the coldness of his aura. He pulled her to her feet with surprising gentleness. "You're not my cousin," Ilara whispered, her voice trembling. Jin-ho looked down at her. She was so small, so fragile, yet she had survived this long on her own. "No," he said softly, "I am not." Ilara looked at the destruction of her home. "Why did you come? You don't even know me." Jin-ho didn't have an answer that made sense even to himself. How could he tell her that her lonely text had been the only honest thing he'd heard in a decade? How could he tell her that he felt a sudden violent need to be the hero she thought she was texting? "You asked for help," he said simply. "In this city, very few people have the courage to do that." He looked around the tiny, broken room.
"This place is no longer safe for you. You are coming with me." Ilara wanted to argue, to say she could handle herself, but she looked at the hole in her wall and the shadows in the hallway. She realized she had no choice. She took her small bag and followed the Shadow King into the night. They arrived at Jinho's estate, a sprawling mansion hidden behind high walls and guarded by men in black suits. To Ilara, it looked like a palace from a dark fairy tale. Jinho led her inside, where the air smelled of sandalwood and old books. He told the servants to prepare a room for her and to bring her food. He treated her not as a prisoner, but as a guest of high honor. That night, Ilara sat by the large window in her new room, watching the rain wash over the city below. She felt like she was in a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. She had been saved from a wolf, only to be taken in by a lion. In his study, Jinho sat at his desk, staring at his phone. He reread the messages Ilara had sent. He found himself smiling, a rare ghost of a movement on his lips. He realized he didn't even know her last name. He realized he didn't care. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about territory or profit. He was thinking about how to make sure she never felt that scared again.
The next morning, Ilara woke up in a bed of silk. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then, the memories of the night before came rushing back. The crash, the men, and the cold eyes of Jinho. She walked downstairs and found him sitting at a long table, reading a newspaper. He looked up as she entered. "Did he sleep well?" he asked. Ilara nodded, sitting far away from him. "Thank you for saving me," she said quietly. "But I need to go back. I have to work. I have debts." Jinho put down the paper. "Your debts have been paid," he said. Ilara's eyes widened. "What? How?" Jinho leaned forward. "The people you owed money to, they no longer exist in a capacity to collect. And your jobs? I've had your resignation sent. You won't be scrubbing floors anymore." Ilara felt a surge of anger. "You can't just decide my life for me. I don't know who you are, but you can't own me." Jinho's expression didn't change. "I don't want to own you, Ilara. I want you to live." Days turned into weeks. Ilara stayed in the mansion, slowly growing accustomed to the quiet luxury. She and Jinho began to spend time together. They walked in the gardens, and she told him stories of her childhood, of her father's laughter and her mother's songs. Jinho listened with an intensity that frightened her. He, in turn, told her nothing of his world, but she saw it in the way his men bowed to him and the way he carried the weight of the city on his shoulders. She began to see the man behind the monster. She saw the way he cared for his elderly housekeeper and the way he stood alone on the balcony at night, looking at the stars. She realized he wasn't just a boss. He was a man who had built a cage of power around himself to keep the world from hurting him. One evening, as they sat in the library, Ilara asked him, "Why do people fear you so much?" Jinho looked at his hands. "Because I do what is necessary, so they don't have to." But peace is a fragile thing in a city like Gyeongsang. Jinho's rivals had noticed his sudden distraction. They heard rumors of a girl living in his fortress, a girl who made the iron shadows soft. A man named Chairman Park, a rival who had long sought to topple Jinho's empire, saw an opportunity. He didn't care about Ilara, but he knew she was the key to Jinho's heart. He began to weave a web of betrayal, bribing one of Jinho's inner circle to feed him information. One afternoon, while Jinho was away at a meeting, Ilara decided to walk in the outer gardens. She felt safe, protected by the high walls. But a gardener she had seen many times approached her with a strange look in his eyes. Before she could scream, a cloth was pressed over her mouth and the world went black. When Jinho returned home an hour later, he found only a discarded ribbon from Ilara's hair and a note pinned to the garden gate. The note was simple. "You took something of mine once. Now I take something of yours. Bring the documents for the harbor district to the old shipyard at midnight, alone." Jinho felt a coldness settle in his bones that was deeper than any winter. He didn't rage, he didn't scream, he simply walked to his armory.
He began to load his weapons with a methodical, terrifying precision. Kale appeared at his side. "Sir, we should call the men." Jinho shook his head. He said alone, "If he sees a single soldier, he'll kill her." Kale looked worried. "It's a trap, sir, you know it is." Jinho looked at the ribbon in his hand. "I know, but she is the only light I've seen in 10 years. I won't let it go out." He drove himself to the shipyard, the engine of his car roaring like a beast. He knew he was walking into a massacre, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't fighting for power. He was fighting for love. The shipyard was a skeleton of rusted metal and long shadows. Jinho stepped out of his car, his coat fluttering in the wind. In the center of a clearing stood Chairman Park, surrounded by 20 armed men. In a chair, bound and gagged, was Ilara. Her eyes were wide with terror, but when she saw Jinho, a look of desperate relief washed over her. Park laughed, a dry, grating sound. The great Jinho brought to his knees by a common girl. How the mighty have fallen. Jinho held up a black briefcase. "The documents are here. Let her go." Park signaled his men to move forward. "Oh, I'll let her go, right after I watch you die." The men raised their weapons. Jinho didn't flinch. He looked at Ilara and gave her a small, reassuring nod. Suddenly, the lights of the shipyard exploded. From the darkness, Kale and Jinho's elite guards descended like ghosts. Jinho knew it was a trap, and he had prepared his own.
The shipyard turned into a battlefield. Bullets whistled through the air, and the sound of clashing metal echoed against the hulls of old ships. Jinho moved with a speed that seemed impossible, a blur of shadow and steel. He reached Ilara in seconds, shielding her body with his own as he cut through her ropes. "Stay down," he shouted over the noise. Ilara huddled on the ground, watching as the man she had come to know as a quiet companion turned into a god of war. He fought with a fierce, protective rage, taking down anyone who came near her. Park, seeing his plan fail, pulled a small pistol from his pocket and aimed it at Jinho's back. Ilara saw it. Without thinking, she screamed, "Jinho, look out!" Jinho spun around just as Park fired. The bullet grazed Jinho's shoulder, but he didn't stop. He lunged at Park, his eyes burning with a murderous light. Jinho stood over the fallen chairman, his hand around the man's throat. He could have ended it then. He should have. His world demanded blood for blood. But he heard a small sob behind him. He turned and saw Ilara, looking at him not with fear of the enemy, but with fear of what he was becoming. He looked at his hands, covered in the grime of battle. He looked at Park, who was shaking and begging for mercy. Jinho realized that if he killed this man in front of her, he would lose the part of himself she had helped him find. He threw Park aside and walked back to Ilara. He picked her up in his arms, ignoring the blood soaking his sleeve. "It's over," he whispered. "Let's go home." The ride back was silent. Ilara held his hand the entire way, her small fingers laced through his. She didn't care that he was a mafia boss. She only cared that he was her savior. In the following days, the mansion was quiet. Jinho spent his time recovering from his wound, and Ilara never left his side. She realized that she loved him, not for his power or his wealth, but for the soul he kept hidden from the rest of the world. She saw that he was a man who had been forced to be a monster by a cruel world, but who still held on to a spark of humanity. One night, as they sat on the terrace, she asked him, "What happens now?" Jinho looked out at the city. "The world I live in, it will never be truly safe for you. I have decided to leave it." Ilara gasped. "But your empire, your men." Jinho smiled, a real, warm smile this time. "I've spent my life building walls. Now I want to build a bridge. I've handed the leadership to Kyle. He is a good man. I am taking my resources and moving us far away, where no one knows the name Iron Shadow." They moved to a small town by the sea, far from the skyscrapers and shadows of Gyeongsang. They lived in a house with a blue door and a garden full of wildflowers. Jinho became a different man. He spent his days painting and his evenings walking on the beach with Ilara.
The city eventually forgot the name Jin-ho, and the underworld moved on to new kings and new wars. But Ilara never forgot the night she sent a text to the wrong number. She often thought about how a single mistake had led her to her greatest blessing. She looked at Jin-ho, who was now just a man who loved her, and she knew that the universe had a strange way of putting people exactly where they needed to be. They were happy, truly happy, for many years. But as with all stories, the past has a way of catching up, even in the quietest of places. One afternoon, a stranger arrived in their small town. He was an old man with a scarred face and eyes that had seen too much. He found Jin-ho sitting on a bench by the water. "The shadow has been missed," the stranger said. Jin-ho didn't look up. "The shadow is dead." The stranger sat down next to him. "Kael is in trouble. A new gang is rising, and they don't respect the old ways. They're burning the city down, Jin-ho. They're killing everyone who was loyal to you." Jin-ho felt a pang of guilt. He had left his men to find his own peace. He looked at the house where Ilara was waiting for him. He knew that if he went back, he might never return, but he also knew that he couldn't let his brothers die. He went home and told Ilara the truth. She didn't cry, she didn't beg him to stay. She simply packed his bag and kissed him. "Come back to me," she said. Jin-ho returned to Gyeongsang like a ghost returning to haunt the living. The city was different, darker, meaner. He found Kael in a hidden basement, wounded and weary. When Kael saw his old boss, he wept. "I couldn't hold it, sir. They're too many." Jin-ho helped him up. "You held it long enough. I'm here now." Word spread through the streets like wildfire. The Iron Shadow had returned. The new gang, led by a ruthless young man who called himself the Viper, laughed at the news. They thought Jin-ho was an old relic, a myth from a forgotten era. They gathered their forces to crush him for once and for all. But they didn't understand that Jin-ho wasn't fighting for power anymore. He was fighting to protect the peace he had found with Ilara. A man with nothing to lose is dangerous, but a man with everything to protect is invincible.
The final confrontation took place in the heart of the city, at the very plaza where Ilara used to scrub floors. Jin-ho stood alone in the center, waiting. The Viper and his army surrounded him, mocking him. "Where are your soldiers, old man?" the Viper sneered. Jin-ho looked up at the moon. "I don't need soldiers. I am the shadow." In that moment, the lights of the plaza went out. One by one, the Viper's men began to fall, taken down by the very people they had oppressed, the shopkeepers, the janitors, the workers who had heard that the Iron Shadow was back to protect them. Jin-ho moved through the chaos like a whirlwind. He reached the Viper and, with a single strike, ended the reign of terror. He didn't kill him. He handed him over to the people he had hurt. The city belonged to its citizens again. Jin-ho stood in the quiet plaza, breathing heavily. He was covered in bruises and exhaustion, but he was alive. Kael came to his side. "Will you stay, sir? The city needs a leader." Jin-ho looked at the tall buildings and the neon lights. He saw the beauty and the pain of the place that had made him. "No," he said. "The city has found its own strength. My place is elsewhere." He walked to the train station, leaving behind his coat and his title for the last time. He boarded a train as the sun began to rise over Gyeongsang. He watched the city fade into the distance, feeling a great weight lift from his shoulders. He was no longer a boss. He was no longer a legend. He was just a man going home to the woman he loved. When he reached the small town by the sea, the air was fresh and smelled of salt. He walked up the path to the house with the blue door. He saw Ilara in the garden, tending to her flowers. She looked up and saw him, and the smile that broke across her face was brighter than any sun. She ran to him, and he caught her in his arms, holding her as if he would never let go. "You came back," she whispered into his chest. "I always come back to you," he replied.
They walked into the house together, closing the door on the world and its shadows. They knew that there would always be challenges, that the world was a wild and unpredictable place, but they also knew that as long as they had each other, they could face anything. And so, the story of the girl and the mafia boss became a legend in the city of Gyeongsang. It was told to children as a reminder that kindness can be found in the darkest places, and that a single message can change the world. They say that if you look closely at the moon on a rainy night, you can see the shadow of a man and a woman walking hand in hand. Ilara and Jinho lived a long and peaceful life, surrounded by the beauty of the sea and the love they had built from a mistake. They proved that no matter how deep the darkness, the light of a true connection can always find a way. For in the end, it wasn't power that saved them, or money, or steel. It was the simple human courage to say, "I am here, and I will not let you fall."